An auditorium that was crowded with political officials, journalists, and industry leaders, all of whom were waiting to hear from JD Vance, created an environment that was exciting. This was not a typical speech. Rather, it was a moment that had the potential to determine his future. JD presented himself to the audience with the self-assurance of someone who had performed this task 100 times before. Usha Vance, his wife, was seated among the audience, and she was only a few seats away from Elon Musk, who had been invited as a member of the VIP guest list. While JD was adjusting the microphone, cameras flashed. The first thing he did was look around the audience and say, "Thank you all for being here today. This nation is currently at a crossroads, and the choices that we make right now will not only have an impact on the upcoming election, but also on the generation that will come after us." JD Vance delivered a speech that was absolutely iconic. It was a combination of policy, conviction, and a few smart barbs at the usual suspects. It was about the economy, about families in the United States, and about the necessity of leadership that truly listens to its constituents. The audience responded with applause and nods at the appropriate times, and JD drew his energy from their enthusiasm. However, after that, something changed. While JD was in the process of wrapping up, his voice began to take on a more intimate tone. With a glance in the direction of Usha, who was standing in the throng, he stated, "I got into this fight because I believe in something that is bigger than politics. I am a firm believer in telling the truth and speaking up, even when doing so is unsettling." A few members of the crowd exchanged looks with one another, as if they were foreseeing the arrival of something further. Prior to continuing, JD took a little pause, during which he held the edges of the podium tightly. This has nothing to do with victories or defeats. The individuals who are present in this room, as well as those who are watching from their homes, are the ones whose voices are not always heard. There should be more applause. Musk leaned back in his chair and gave a slight nod, almost as if he had heard all of this before. He appeared to remember it all. Meanwhile, Usha remained totally still in her seat. JD let out a sigh and gave a resolute nod. "I am grateful to you." The audience applauded. JD, who was getting ready to exit the stage, moved away from the microphone. It was a good speech. There was nothing that was particularly provocative or that would cause it to be reported in the media for the wrong reasons. To put it another way, it was his thought, due to the fact that Usha stood up at precisely the moment when he took his first step away from the podium. In addition, she was already making her way toward the stage before anybody else was aware of what was taking place, and before JD himself had even had the opportunity to react. As Usha Vance stood up from her seat, the applause was still showing signs of diminishing. In no way was it dramatic. There is no hurry. Do not be hesitant. Nothing more than a slow and careful movement. At first, nobody noticed it or gave it any thought. Could it be that she was making her way into the backstage area in order to meet JD? It's B that she simply required some time away from the crowd. Then, however, she proceeded to walk directly toward the stage. The murmurings began abruptly at that moment. A few people turned their heads. Although he was only a few seats away, Elon Musk arched his eyebrow, indicating that he was clearly curious. Although JD Vance had just ended his speech, his wife was heading up to the podium. What was the reason for this? JD had already come down from the stage and was making his way back to his seat when he became aware of the change that had taken place in the room. After turning around, he saw Usha grabbing for his microphone barely in the nick of time. In spite of its speed, the moment was purposeful. She did not steal it from me. It was not a scene that she made. She merely extended her hand, and JD, who was taken aback by her gesture, led her to take one. As soon as Usha Vance takes JD Vance's microphone on live television, the entire earth seems to quake. Observe his response all the time. The rumblings escalated in volume. The focus of a couple of cameras was altered. It was completely unexpected. After a brief pause, JD looked from Usha to the audience, and then back again from the audience to Usha. He could have stopped her and asked what she was doing, but instead, he simply nodded slightly and went aside, proceeding toward his seat in the front row, right next to Musk. He could have asked her what she was in the middle of doing. The focus of attention was now on Usha Vance. After adjusting the microphone, she let out a deep breath and turned her gaze directly toward the audience. Nothing could be heard in the room. In no way was this a predetermined moment. No teleprompters and no notes for the speech. Not even the people who were organizing the event appeared to know what to do. JD took a seat. his look being indecipherable. During his attentive observation, Musk crossed his arms. It was impossible to deny the significance of the moment. Finally, Usha made her voice heard. "I wasn't supposed to be up here today," she started, maintaining a calm tone in her voice. "Nevertheless, after hearing everything that has been spoken, I came to a realization about something. There is something more that needs to be taken care of." A silence descended upon the room. There was more to this than just an addition to JD's remarks. However, this was a whole different issue. To add insult to injury, no one in the room was prepared for whatever it was that she was going to say next. With a calm and authoritative demeanor, Usha Vance stood at the podium and firmly grasped the microphone. It was impossible to deny the significance of the moment. She was not merely occupying empty space. It was time for her to say something that was quite necessary to say. The first thing that she said was, "I would like to take a moment to talk about something that isn't discussed nearly enough." It was a calm yet forceful tone to her voice. There is a lot of discussion that takes place around leadership, principles, and the importance of sticking up for what is right. However, here is the reality. During times when it is necessary to take action and when choices are being taken behind closed doors, an excessive number of individuals choose to remain silent. The air in the room became more congested. With an expression that was difficult to discern, JD, who was now sat in the first row, watched. Musk, who was still seated next to him, gave a tiny grin, showing that he was curious but had not yet responded. Before proceeding, Usha let the silence to pass for a while. "We elect leaders because we believe they will fight for us," she added, her eyes searching the room. "We believe their convictions are more than simply talking points, and we trust that they will fight for us. However, what takes place when the cameras are turned off and the decisions that truly matter are made? When there is no one else around to observe, how many of them are willing to voice their opinions? Only a few individuals moved around in their chairs. There were some who nodded. Others exchanged glances with one another, unsure as to the direction this was going. Usha was not making an assault on JD. Although she was not outright insulting anyone, she was making people feel uneasy throughout the conversation. As she continued, she stated that the reality is that we cannot afford to remain complacent. This is true for everyone, including those who are currently performing on stage, those who are currently in the crowd, and those who are watching from home. Simply bringing up the topic of change is not enough. What we need to do is demand it, and when our leaders fail to meet our expectations, we need to hold them accountable. While he was listening, JD gently exhaled. Not even he was able to stop her. He did not disrupt in any way. Her time had finally come. Musk sat back in his chair and crossed his arms over his chest. Not only was he not chatting with someone next to him, but he was also not going through his phone. With great attention, he was observing. The final words that Usha spoke were delivered with accuracy. If there is one thing that leadership implies, it is just showing up. This is not just something to do when it is convenient or simple. It is something to do when it genuinely matters. She took a few steps away from the microphone in order to allow the significance of her remarks to sink in. A hush fell over the room. The kind of silence that follows a normal speech is not the kind that is polite and expected. Rather, it is the kind that occurs after something that was utterly unexpected has just finished happening. Because Usha Vance had spoken without any notes or prior notice, everyone was now attempting to comprehend the significance of what she had said. JD Vance remained seated in the front row, maintaining the same face that was difficult to decipher. Additionally, he was not clapping, nor was he shaking his head, nor was he shifting in an excessively uncomfortable manner. Simply put, he was observing. Elon Musk, who was standing next to him, did not move, and his arm crossed. He was not displaying any signs of a severe reaction if he did have one. At the same time that he was examining Usha as if she were an interesting problem that he had not yet solved, he tilted his head slightly. An individual who was seated a few seats away cleared their throat. The spectators were torn by two different instincts. How do they react? They wait for JD to respond before taking action. Absolutely no one was aware of the procedure for what had just taken place. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, even though it was really only a few seconds, JD leaned forward slightly. Both he and Elon Musk were taken aback by the news. In a manner that suggested he was aware of something, Musk gave JD a tiny smirk and said in a volume that was just loud enough for him to hear, "Did you know she was going to do that?" As JD exhaled through his nostrils, he gave a single shake of his head. No. Even yet, he did not appear to be in a hurry to go to the stage. In no way was he attempting to reclaim the microphone. During this time, Usha had moved away from the podium by a single step, and she was holding her hands together in front of her back. It was clear that she was not going to back down, but she was also not gloating. This was not a prank at all. The words that she had been wanting to say had been spoken, and she was now allowing them to stand on their own. It was obvious that the event organizers were at a loss for what to do next as they stared at each other. Last but not least, one of them approached the podium with a voice that was calm and deliberate. "Oh, I am grateful to you, Mrs. Vance." There is a pause. "We will now go to the next speaker in our lineup." The audience continued to murmur uncontrollably, which made it difficult to hear the remainder of the phrase. In spite of the fact that the event would proceed, the moment would not be forgotten. JD sat back in his chair and eventually reclined back. By casually tapping his fingers on the armrest, he demonstrated that he was not upset. The shock had not yet worn off. As he turned to face him, Musk continued to grin. "So, what will take place now?" Because, to tell you the truth, JD was uncertain, he chose not to respond. The gravity of the situation continued to linger. Not only had Usha not walked off the stage in a huff, but she had also not lingered on for too long. Instead of doing anything else, she only remained there for a moment, allowing the weight of what she had said to rest over the space. Because she was not searching for applause, the impact of what she said was amplified to a greater degree. While still in a state of shock, JD Vance remained immobile in the front row. Aside from the fact that he was not angry or shaken, he also did not appear to be smiling. His mind was processing and pondering. Elon Musk, on the other hand, displayed a knowing twinkle in his eye after the initial shock that he experienced. He was familiar with situations similar to this one. Unanticipated disturbances that altered the course of talks, movements, and the relationships between individuals. Not once did he appear to be irritated or frustrated. More than anything else, he appeared to be amused. Usha inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly before coming back to a little inclination toward the microphone. The tone of her voice remained firm as she stated, "I'm not here to debate or make headlines. The only question I want folks to ask themselves is an important one. When it comes time to make a decision that is challenging, will you choose to adhere to your beliefs, or will you choose the option that is the least difficult? There will be no assault, no pointing of fingers, simply a challenge. A question that each and every voter, business leader, and politician in that room was unable to ignore." She cast a fleeting glance in JD's direction for a split second. The purpose of this is not to seek acceptance or to apologize. Rather, it is to simply acknowledge him. Then, with a calm and confident demeanor, she repositioned the microphone on the podium and stepped down from the podium. During that brief period of time, nobody was sure whether they should applaud or simply remain silent in awe. It was unclear to the event organizers how to proceed after what had just taken place, so they exchanged nervous glances with one another. JD let out a sigh, but continued to remain silent. In front of him, his wife had just placed the entire room on notice, and she had done it in front of him. In an effort to shatter the stillness that had been prevailing between them, Musk leaned in closer and said with a smirk, "I must say that was quite fascinating." JD did not provide a response. For a split second, his jaw clenched its muscles. At long last, he gave a slight nod. One thing was certain despite the fact that the situation was filled with a great deal of unpredictability. Just now, Usha Vance had altered the course of the conversation. While the program continued, there was a noticeable shift in the energy that was present in the room. As the next speaker approached the podium, the audience continued to be partially preoccupied, murmuring, staring at JD, and giving Usha a sand-tealing look. It was not a spontaneous response from JD. Even though he hadn't resisted, it was obvious that his thoughts were racing. Musk continued to grin as he sat back forward in his chair with his arms crossed. On the other hand, he said something that was just loud enough for JD to hear, and that wasn't on the agenda. JD let out a sigh and turned his attention to his wife at last. Usha was not attempting to avert his eyes. She did not express any regret. In any case, she appeared to be composed and unruffled. The words that she had spoken were exactly what she intended to say, and she had no intention of retracting them. Just for a brief moment, JD was observing her. After that, he offered the tiniest of nods, which were almost imperceptible. 1.5 of them were the only ones who knew what that meant. During this time, the crew at the event was working hard to re-establish control. Despite the fact that Usha Vance had just rattled the entire room, the moderator managed to muster up a grin and express gratitude to the next speaker for their patience. But everyone was aware of the truth. JD Vance had arrived with the intention of making an early impression. On the contrary, it was his wife who had brought about the event that no one would ever easily forget. And in the end, nobody anticipated that this would happen. Is it possible that Usha Vance has just reshaped the conversation in ways that no one anticipated? Is it possible that she has just placed JD in an impossible situation? What do you believe will take place after this?